to Far na Fáilte Rovers Ceathan Shaw. This final session is going to look at some questions specifically about Irish traditional music, and just to make sure we all know what we're talking about, we're going to play you some Irish traditional music, just to check in that we're talking about the same things here. And also, before the session starts as well, I just want to ask you to think about two things. I don't need you to answer me right now, but maybe next year. Do you value Irish traditional music? And secondly, if you do, how do you value it? And I just want you to think about those things as the conversation spins out over the next while. But before that, we're going to kick off with a tune. It's a double jig called The Lark in the Morning. I know this is The Lark in the Afternoon, but it's a very well-known tune, and it's just to set the tone for what follows. Okay. We go there. At the one peg. Thanks very much indeed. That was The Lark in the Morning, played by Toner Quinn here on fiddle and Emer Mayock and pipes. And our third panelist here, Dr. Una Monaghan, would have played had you got the harp, but it's logistically difficult. The session we're going to do now was kind of prompted by an article that Toner Quinn here published in the Journal of Music, which is a digital publication that provides a platform for critical discussion of issues relating to music in Ireland. The publication is almost 20 years old. It began life as a paper publication, and it's made a transition into the digital world. And in Toner's piece, he spoke about issues to do with how music is valued, which is why I asked you to think about those two questions a wee while ago. Do you value Irish traditional music or music? Doesn't matter what form. And if you do, how do you do that? And the backdrop for this piece by Toner was to do with developments at national policy level, and where the state or the government is saying creativity, culture, and the arts belong. They're saying it belongs at the centre of things. So Toner's article scratched the surface of that and says, what does that look like, and what might it mean? And that's really kind of stimulated the backdrop to this discussion. Emer Mayock here is from Mayo, and Emer has a very comprehensive involvement in traditional music as a performer, as a composer, as an educator and a teacher, as a facilitator, as a creative collaborator, as a researcher, as an advisor, a policy advisor, among other things. And we're going to hear some of Emer's perspectives on what this world of being a a working musician is like. And Una Monaghan, who you heard in one of this morning's sessions, Una comes to this conversation as well with that, I suppose you call it a portfolio background of different ways of being involved in traditional music. And I think it's interesting that some of the topics that came up in earlier sessions today are probably germane to what we're going to talk about now. Like we're ultimately talking about some part of the intangible, invisible but felt infrastructure for Irish identity and Irish creativity. And it's embodied in people and people's behaviours and people's beliefs and the whole music system. And the traditional music system, perhaps people see it as a shorthand for something really good about Ireland, which is to say it's rooted in communities all over Ireland. It's a transgenerational activity. Age doesn't really matter. In fact, I've often said if you go into an authentic session somewhere, it doesn't matter in a rural or urban district. The older generation seems to be the honeypot that the younger people are drawn to, because that's how this music works. It gets passed on, it gets changed and passed on, and that's a very healthy thing. There's the transference of skills, understandings, insights, information, knowledge, wisdom, all these things we talked about. A lot of the things that Eamon spoke about in his keynote address as well about citizenship, prosperity, sustainability. I think you find all in traditional music, we live with these things every day, and we don't always see them, perhaps. But here's the other thing that we also live with as well. And Myrne Kelleher spoke about this in her session in design when she said, it looks as though like we expect our creative people to operate under conditions of what you might call precariousness at best, or maybe anxiety-inducing at worst. And there's an awful lot of issues that go with that as well. So that's a very interesting set of things to talk about here. And one other point I wanted to mention as well is, and it was articulated by Toner in his article as well, when Ireland talks about how much Ireland values the arts and the artists, some really interesting things, positive things, true things, facts that are said. So we have a generally a favourable taxation regime in parts for artists, and we have infrastructure and organisations. We have local authority art structures, library structures, etc., etc. But Toner made a point in his article that when you look at the big figures that are mentioned for culture, the hundreds of millions of euros, for example, that's quite a large kind of number in my book. Toner says all too rarely these numbers trickle down to the practicing artist. And I was discussing with someone the other day a recently published strategy by a broadcaster who assert that they are responsible for sustaining like hundreds of creative jobs by what they call creative operators. I suppose we are creative operators, but I wonder, does that number of hundreds of creative operators include people who are asked to play a tune on a television program? So you spend half a day, you record 2 minutes of music, you get 200 quid, and then you go home. So are you head counted in that? So all of a sudden, are we looking like an employment statistic or maybe a high-value output statistic, when in fact the reality is quite different? I don't know how many people could sustain a livelihood, much less a career, on that kind of patchy, episodic level of income. So we want to start having a conversation about what is it like. We're not here to complain about things. We're here to just give the audience and the viewers all around the world a sense of what is it like to be a practicing, working musician in Ireland right now at the moment. So Toner, can I start with you and just ask you to maybe reprise on some of the key points of that article you published in the Journal of Music?
Sure. The article was actually prompted by something I read in the Global Ireland document, and it was quite an extreme example of something that musicians would see a lot of, which is big figures, not much trickling down. But it said that Culture Ireland, which supports artists abroad, had created 240 full-time jobs for working artists abroad. Now, when you start a music magazine, one of the things that happens quite quickly is that you're in touch with almost every professional and performing musician in the whole country. And I was pretty sure there wasn't 240 full-time artists, because because even the best of our musicians sometimes, and when you're editing a music magazine, you do become a kind of flashpoint for frustration as well. And people ring you when certain things happen to talk them through and to look for a bit of perspective. And I've been struck for years at the fact that really well-known musicians would sometimes ring me and just tell me, this is difficult, you know. This is really difficult, even though I'm doing these concerts. I need one of these every day, or I need 4 of these a week. So it was extremely challenging for them. So I was prompted to write the article when I saw that figure, because I knew well that this couldn't be true. But, you know, funding for music, funding for the arts, there is so much discussion about it. For me, and I would like to just really set out very, very, very early on the way I think about it, and this is after years of studying the way it works through editing the Journal of Music. But, you know, I don't think I need to convince anyone here of the value of traditional music, and not just because the music we played, like, you know, like, you know, and Nisha's and Quil's music earlier on was really wonderful. But, you know, to support music, the reason we love having music in our society is because it enriches our lives, and it changes our lives, and it changes the way we think. Even listening to Lisha and Quilsa earlier on, it kind of changed the way I thought for a bit. And my mind was jumping ahead going, I must do this, I must think about that, that's really interesting. It changes the way we think, and it enriches our lives. So that's why we support music. It's very, very simple. How do you actually support music? 2 ways, in my mind. You give money directly to the artists, or you give money to the infrastructure which supports the artists. It's very, very simple. What is in that infrastructure? Festivals, promoters, publishers, record labels, venues. It's very, very straightforward. Now, anything that distracts from that very simple process is where I become frustrated as a musician, certainly, and something talking to musicians and artists. And it does happen too many times. I think what I've just explained there in 90 seconds is a pretty simple way of looking at the arts. It is pretty simple. The art, we need the artists to enrich our lives. Let's support them directly, or the infrastructure. But I do think that there's a lot of muddled thinking around it. You know.
Una, could I ask you from your perspective and the multiple ways that you have to adapt and do things, the various skill sets that you need to bring into play to be a musician in Ireland? Do you want to just talk from your perspective of what are the challenges, what are the hard bits of getting into it and staying in it?
I guess I can only speak from my perspective, and in many ways I feel in my career, you called it a portfolio career, and there's many ways to describe it. I'm just thinking now, I think of it as being on a rolling log sometimes. Like, I know what I'm interested in, but I don't actually know exactly what's going to happen later. I do 4 different things in my head, that all of which I consider to be me. One of which is sound engineering, one of which is playing, performing music, one of which is writing music, and one of which is music and academic research. So, and this touches on what I just heard in the education panel there as well. I remember being much younger, and it still happened up until about 3 years ago with a teacher from school that I used to go and visit. And she would say to me, so what are you doing this year? And I would explain some of those 4 things I was doing, and I would think it was great. And she would say, do you know, I saw an advertisement in the BBC there the other day. Would you not think of maybe getting into the BBC? And and I don't fault this sort of thinking either, because it comes from a place, and certainly I remember from a society which is just, you know, my mommy's and daddy's generation, where they want you to be okay. They want you to be safe and have a career. And just in the course of that, I just wrote down, there was 4 things that made me think of why I don't go into the BBC or go somewhere where there's something safe and stable in that way. And there were 4 things. It's usually because there's something wrong with the job. Like, I don't like it. And I was trying to think of reasons for it. And one of the things that was like the financial industry or capitalism, consumerism, that sort of a thing. You know, I don't like how the job is set up. The second thing is that it's driven by forces that are beyond my control. And so if I got into that job, I'm not sure I would actually be able to control what was happening to me. And in that, I think of IT and Facebook and the like. The third thing is that they're often moving too quickly for me to be able to commit to their structures. And I'm thinking of the school curriculum. You know, the GCSE would change every year. And so to take a job that you're not sure if it's going to change in a couple of years, a fixed job, wasn't something I wanted to commit to. And the last thing is that they work on structures that no longer apply today. So things like pensions, permanent, you know, the would you not get a job in the BBC. So that's kind of my thinking. And to counteract those 4 issues that I see with very fixed jobs, they're not really there for me in the music industry. So what I'm doing is trying to do things I'm interested in and trying to do as many things as possible that I believe in. And that has resulted in all of these different types of engaging with the music industry.
And Una, can I ask, would you call that then a career or trying to make a livelihood, or would you distinguish between those?
The career thing, people say, oh, did you always want to be a musician? And I never would have said that, because there was a struggle to, if that doesn't happen, well, then you failed. So I don't think of it as a career. I do think of it as on the rolling log. And every year I manage to continue to do something that interests me, that's related to the arts, that is about the head and the heart, that communicates to people. Every year I manage to get a living that way. Has been in the past, you know, a continuous source of pride and surprise. But more recently I've thought, well, actually it's been 10 years now. So I can start to believe in this as something that is what I do. But it's taken a long time for me to be able to adequately answer the people who say to me, are you sure you're all right? And I'm not sure I'm all right, you know. I'm not sure I'm going to be all right, and I'm not sure what I would say to any child I had, you know, either. So yes, the precariousness is a reality, and it's something that it's taken me a long time to get used to. And it's something, and this is another thing about the arts. I studied a physics background, so I understand why the arts needs to be in the STEM curriculum. The things that have got me able to deal in this kind of a life are things that I learned through artwork. That is trusting that there's going to be something come out of this on your blank page. If you set out to make an artwork, it takes a long time for you to believe that eventually something's going to come, if you trust, and to be okay with the precariousness at the start of that artwork. Those are things that are the only thing makes me able to continue in this career, which I learned from the making of artworks, is to be okay with the uncertainty and to trust. Now, I don't say that's okay. It's not fun. It's really, really mentally taxing to be like that. But that's the way I view what I see as my reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think when Muireann mentioned that whole issue this morning about precariousness, it brought back a flash of a memory to me. I remember walking down, I'm from Derry, and I remember walking down the Strand Road in Derry years ago, and there was a lamppost, and obviously some religious people had been out, and they put up a wee sign. It was yellow paper with black heavy print on it, and it said, "The wages of sin is death." And somebody had written underneath it, "Aye, but the hours are great." So I wonder, is there a version, like, will there ever be a version of precariousness as it applies to musicians? It might be well-paid precariousness, because we aren't the only highly trained, highly skilled, very highly regarded, world-renowned professional providers of services that do nothing but good. There are other service providers who probably do similar things that are non-musical, but who probably get paid a multiple of what musicians get paid, and they probably don't complain about precariousness. But that's an entirely different.
Well,
different
the multiple
set of
paid will really help with that.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. Emer, what's your take on this whole prospect for an Ireland that's celebrating its creativity at the centre of everything, and a thriving musical community, and where we'll be better off?
Well, firstly, as you know, and as you've said, I mean, traditional music is incredibly enriching, and for the people who engage with it and the people who have it in their lives, I think we'd all agree we enjoy that very much. Making a living from it is quite a more precarious thing, as outlined by Una in her journey with it. I again speak from my own journey, which was very much from the beginning. I wanted to be a musician, and but just on that point, I think as you become an adult, it becomes very clear to you that you have to create your own job. And within that job comes a huge amount of content that you have to create, most of it. Some things you are asked to do, but mostly you originate the work if you want to build a career as a musician. And it doesn't always, as we know, involve performing and playing and doing the things that you really want to do, like writing, creating new work, collaborating. It doesn't always happen like that. So in that journey, you do create opportunities for yourself to further engage with the job of being an artist as a traditional musician, and you have to do that in order to survive. On the level of the way that Ireland is viewed as, and as Tony said in his article, Ireland, for a lot of people, Ireland means music. And I sometimes wonder, how is music understood or perceived by people in Ireland? And how is it understood and perceived by people outside of Ireland, to whom it is presented or sold? And also, what is quite complex is how traditional music occurs on so many different levels in Ireland. So you can't say traditional music and cover anything, really. You have to go to the fact that this is happening here today, but somebody had a music class this morning, and that was really important, and I had a tune with you guys, and that was traditional music. And tonight, there's somebody being honoured who's 82 years old, and he's contributed hugely to traditional music in Mayo. You know, so that's only one day. There's the person who wants to think really big project. They want to write, they want to involve other genres, they want to interact with other artists, with writers. So traditional music can exist in a microcosm, and it can exist in whatever form it can viably take, and that might be on any stage. Mm. Whether it works or not is a different thing, and whether we agree that it works in certain guises is for debate on an artistic level. What I would be kind of wondering about is the value of the package that is traditional music as it's sold as a cultural product leaving Ireland. I would worry a little bit about.
Say more about that.
I would worry about what, again, you can say it in one way, like the way the figures are given in one way, and what the reality of that is in another way. The reality of touring abroad for a traditional musician is pretty... it is not to defile or undermine anything that people are doing, but it's really difficult. It's really difficult. It's becoming increasingly difficult. It doesn't pay very much. It's wearing on the artist, on the music. And in the long term, there is quite a lot of the tail wagging the dog in terms of what promoters want, what their perception of what traditional music is, and what they want to sell to audiences who, no fault of their own, have a perception of what traditional music is. And we know that that is not always true. So, for instance, there might be, I mean, of course, as Toner has said, he would hear a lot of anecdotal evidence from people of this is what it's like. So there would be kind of expectations that dance shows would sell a huge amount of tickets. So that's kind of really the avenue you need to go to if you want to work with that promoter, that kind of thing. So in the global Ireland, I would hope that the way we want to represent traditional music is in all its wonderful ways that gives the artist the chance to be on a stage and to make the music they want to make, as opposed to what the promoter or the agent or the crude bums on seats version of events has managed to at the moment take a lot of ground. You know.
And to see now, I'm just going to open this to the three of you, whoever wants to talk about it. The impact of our current digital reliance on digital for everything. So, what difference does that make to you now in terms of getting your you used the word content, Emer, getting your content to your audience or to somebody who wants to buy it? I mean, cassettes are gone, vinyl isn't really around the CDs kind of getting
Yeah.
a little bit thin on the ground. There must surely be issues there for basic income generation for people.
Definitely. I mean, as we discussed 20 years ago, you went on tour and your CDs were practically almost half of your earnings, really, in a way. And my car still has a CD player, but probably the next one I get won't have that. Your laptop doesn't have a drive, so those are issues that face the musician, the traditional musician, where you actually had a physical product to sell, which, filled a gap because we need that gap to be filled. I'm also very conscious of the fact that musicians need to record and they need to be prompted to record in order to get into that space, because it's a creative space. And it's a safe, creative space where you spend X amount of time creating something, and it's really important. And I would worry that if people don't have the impetus of the financial gain from it, because now content is so cheaply available and free and people expect that, paying €20 for a CD is a big ask for people all of a sudden, where I used to buy imports that cost €35 or, box sets that cost 60. And always, so to support the musician is even harder, even if you are a supporter, So I see problems. I see not unsolvable problems, but I'd like to flag them.
You've just come through the whole CD production thing recently.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking of what you're saying there, Emer. I never did that kind of tour and sell a CD. So this was my first CD this year, and it was built completely on a body of music that I'd written that was experimental. I've never really worked in a band or played traditional music that was completely, I guess, without any experimentalism or digital. So this album was, I only made like 200 or 500 copies or something. I never engaged with that or knew to engage with that whole system of promoters. You tour the album, you sell the album. So people saw that I'd released it and would say to me, so how's the album going? And I had no idea how to answer that. I mean, I didn't know. I said, well, I never really I only made a certain amount, because for me it was getting my compositions down. If someone somewhere wanted to buy it, I was able to say, here it is, but there was no part of me. I didn't even manage to do a launch tour or any of that. It wasn't really on my radar, because, like I say, my kind of mode of operating was, well, what jobs do you have? And at this point you make about making your own work. I kind of came in a wee bit after all of that, so I never learned that or experienced that. And so I guess the diversity, I guess, of what I do has meant that I never really had that part of it.
Tony, have you anything to say on that digital issue?
Yeah, the issue about CDs really highlights, I'm sorry to bring it back again, but the whole issue of infrastructure in traditional music. It really does. Here we have a situation where the traditional musicians, the role of the traditional musician, the creator, is just to produce the best music they can. But now we have thousands and thousands of traditional musicians trying to solve a business model problem, which is crazy, absolutely crazy. They shouldn't be worrying about this. They shouldn't be focusing on it. Yes, there will always be, a minority in the artistic world that are entrepreneurial and want to get into the business side and the business model side. But really, if you think about it now, it's now 2018. We're, 50, 60 years into, the folk revival, as we called it, and there isn't a single full-time traditional music record label in Ireland, which is an extraordinary thing. Now, I know traditional musicians are brilliant at recording and they have freedom, but having run a business for 18 years, there is a lot to be said for having a full-time marketing person, and their role is just to promote your music and to worry about that. And it's a really big issue, and it comes back to the infrastructure and who is thinking about this, who is planning. And the state really needs to think about this, because unless the traditional musicians are going to do it, but it's going to be difficult. Ideally, 50, 60 years into the fact that we are the centre of a global art form, just like jazz or just like another music. Ireland is the centre of a global music, and these are the kind of things we need to think about in 2018.
I wonder if it's creatively built into us. Because there has been this thing about traditional music where you show up to a pub that you don't know the people in, you're able to fit in, you try to fit in. were improvisers. I was doing sound at a theatre a couple of weeks ago, and I arrived, and the in-house engineer said to me, "Oh, I love the trad gigs. Like, they show up and they're just nothing's a problem. They're dead nice." You know, they were comparing that, I guess, with musicians from other genres, and and so I wonder whether, like, we're used finding solutions for stuff, we're used fitting in, we're used creatively working it out, and whether that, in a way, is their own worst enemy. And like,
Go ahead, Tony.
I think it's fine until the traditional musician, you know, who, you know, like I was reading Tommy Peoples' book really recently, you know, and he was writing all, who died, the famous Donegal fiddle player who died this year, and he was writing all about the terrible experiences he had with his recordings. Now, his recordings in the 70s literally changed all of our lives, without a shadow of a doubt, and by default, changed our country, changed our culture, changed the future of Ireland. His recordings did, in lots and lots of different ways. And, you know, you just...
I think, yeah, and that's...
He never made a penny out of them.
Absolutely. Just getting back to that idea of, like, say, Una coming into traditional music from the point of view where you made your first record and you recorded your music without any idea or any, you know, not idea, but you didn't think of it in terms of a backdrop to something else that you were going to be doing. And that's interesting. And then, you know, the kind of music that people recorded when they're given, you know, that opportunity to go and we have a document of their music. That's brilliant. It's very tragic for people who ended up being very disillusioned by the fact that their seminal recording might have, you know, come out on a really cheap CD with liner notes that didn't correlate with any of the tune. That has happened to a lot of people. But getting back to the traditional musician and how the traditional musician is kind of primed to do things in a particular way. You know, traditional musicians went onto the stage in America at the beginning of the 20th century and even before that. And ever since that, we've been entertaining. Entertaining is the thing that traditional musicians did when they got on the stage. Quite literally, one of the best pipers ever, Patsy Toohey, was an entertainer. He was quite literally he was a clown. So I think that's very interesting in terms of the psyche of the musician, of what are you here for, you know? When you get on the stage, you know, the people who have the stories about the tunes, that's actually a very important, integral part of our tradition. There's many older musicians who won't really want to play the tune until they've told the story, because that's really important. But what that came to mean in another sense was that if you were funny, or if you, you know, had a great old story, you know, to accompany your 8 or 10 sets for the night, then you were funnier and you were more pleasing to the audience. So I think it has come to a point, and maybe for lots of people, they discovered in their lives that they just left the performing arena because they weren't allowed to be artists. And they realized that performing is entertaining people. It's not actually an opportunity to, you know, to share your work or to try out your work or to experiment your work. There's an expectation once you get on the stage that is other than being an artist.
Good point. I'm just conscious of time here. So we're going to revert to type now and play some tunes. Before that, I just want to thank Muireann Kelleher, Philip King and Nuala O'Connor for the invitation to bring this conversation into Ireland's edge. It's hard to think of a better place than Ballina and indeed the west of Ireland generally. They have these types of conversations because I still believe that the powerhouse of so much of the imagination and the shape and flavour of our music resides in the west of Ireland, particularly the northwest. But it's also great to have this conversation in the context of I suppose an intellectual discourse that's been running since 2015 with Ireland's Edge about what exactly does all this stuff mean, and where they are reserves of special resources actually reside. So some of the points that Una and Emer made, particularly just they do remind us of all of the skills that you need to walk into a room of people who you don't know, and you start playing something on a musical instrument. It's quite an involved, quite an intimate interaction that can happen, you know. And though I find myself in my own professional work, I have to do other things to sustain my lifestyle as an occasional musician. I find a lot of the skills that you pick up over the years from meeting musicians or interacting with them are fantastic for facilitating or chairing or dealing with difficult issues sometimes with people. If you focus on the music, everything else goes out the window. So if you can focus on the thing that you want, as we heard this morning, about how to get yourself into space, focus on it, and you'll get there. I think the skills that you pick up as a musician in negotiating and communicating are invaluable, and also understanding that there's values behind this, and the values aren't purely monetary or rooted in a capitalist system. They go far beyond that. They're very much pro bono publico. They belong to everybody and they belong to nobody at the same time, which is probably how people like us get into it. So we're going to finish up now with two reels called The Trip to Douro and Nuala O'Connor's favourite reel, which is called The Sailor's Bonnet. Okay, Emer.
And by the way, it's a pleasure to play with Tona and Dermot.
Thank you.
It's not just for the money, you know.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. That's really true.
Thank you very much. I also like the trip to Douro. I think it might be my second favourite. Thank you all very, very much for being such a wonderful, wonderful audience. And we're so happy to be in Ballina. Thank you, Joanne. I see you there. Stuck it out right through the whole day. And all the Mayo County Council, Hollister, Intel, John, all, the two Johns, Sean, everybody who's come and spoken, and I hope it has sparked a discourse that will go out from here and change the country, really. So thank you all very much, and good night, Liv Galair, agus Slán Tamil.
Well done, Nuala.